of the indoctrination system, and they are also the ideological managers, so they have to be instilled in them the right ideas, namely the proper falsehoods. Bush supporters, who are the best educated, scored lowest overall on factual judgments. Now, the public is not unaware of what's happening. Although with the success of the policies of isolation and breakdown of organizational structure, the response is erratic and self-destructive. Faith in billionaire saviors, myths of past innocence, and all sorts of fanaticism, mixtures that have not had happy consequences in the past. In this general framework, the Cold War can be understood in large measure as an interlude in the North-South conflict of the Columbian era, unique in scale, but quite similar to other episodes in its basic logic. Even before Columbus, Eastern and Western Europe were diverging, in fact, along a fault line that goes right down Germany. The Bolshevik takeover quickly eliminated any socialist elements, but it was radical nationalist. It was a threat to stability in the technical sense and had no little appeal elsewhere. In short, the Soviet Union from 1917 was a gigantic rotten apple. And naturally, it called forth the usual reaction, including immediate military intervention. Now, of course, there are other pretexts. So if you take a look at, say, the George Kennan scholarly history of Soviet-American relations, he writes that it was the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918 that created the breach with the Western world with an element of finality. The British ambassador was deeply shocked, he said, and promoted armed intervention from that point on. Woodrow Wilson was particularly offended. A few months later, Wilson's invading army dissolved the National Assembly and occupied Haiti by genuine Marine Corps methods, in the words of the Marine Commander Smedley Butler, Major Smedley Butler. The reason was that Haitian legislators had refused to ratify a constitution imposed by the invaders that gave them the right to buy up Haiti's lands. There was then a Marine-run plebiscite that remedied the problem, arranging for the Constitution to be ratified with 99.9% approval, with 5% of the population participating. Accordingly, Wilson is revered as a great moral teacher and the apostle of self-determination and freedom. The Bolsheviks, in contrast, had violated our high principles and had to be overthrown by force. Following the same high principles, the U.S. enthusiastically welcomed the fine young revolution carried out in Italy in 1922, as the American ambassador described it. Well into the 1930s, Mussolini was that admirable Italian gentleman, in the words of the man who took credit for the Constitution enforced on Haiti, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Fascist atrocities were acceptable because they blocked the threat of a second Russia, the State Department explained. Hitler was described as a moderate for the same reason. In 1937, the State Department saw fascism as the natural reaction of the rich and middle classes in self-defense when the dissatisfied masses, with the example of the Russian Revolution before them, swing to the left. Fascism, it said, must therefore succeed, or the masses, this time reinforced by the disillusioned middle class, will again turn to the left. As you doubtless know, that conception is now being revived by ultra-right and neo-Nazi German historians, and will doubtless be the accepted doctrine of the future, given its utility for power interests. A host of other murderers and torturers were placed in power and supported on exactly the same grounds. The actual logic of the Cold War from 1917 was much the same as in the case of Grenada or Guatemala, although the scale of the problem was vastly different. The situation became more dire after 1945, when traditional Eastern European service areas were removed and the virus reached such a level of military power that it actually had a deterrent effect, lending assistance to targets of U.S. attack. It's kind of interesting to see how the problem of this oversized rotten apple was dealt with in policymaking, led to some curious contortions. There was a major secret study of July 1945, recently declassified, in which planners tried to put a satisfactory gloss on the U.S. intention to take control of the world and surround Russia with military force while denying the adversary any rights at all beyond its borders. That may seem to be open to the criticism of being illogical, they worried. But the criticism, they explained, is only superficially plausible. The reason it's the U.S. plan, they said, is a logical illogicality. That's my favorite phrases. The reason is that by no stretch of the imagination could the U.S. and Britain be thought to have expansionist or aggressive ambition, but Russia is different for the following reason. They're quoting, "There's a rising tide all over the world wherein the common man aspires to higher and wider horizons, and we cannot be certain that the Russians have not flirted with the thought of associating themselves with this criminal conspiracy, pursuing the commie tactic of appealing to the poor who have always wanted to plunder the rich," as Dulles Slater put it. In other words, only when it has clearly adopted the principle that the rich men must have their way everywhere may the Russians be allowed to enter the servants' quarters. It's worth bearing in mind that there was no high-level concern over Russian aggression, and furthermore, crucially, that Western leaders were completely untroubled by Stalin's awesome crimes. Truman, for example, wrote that he liked and admired Stalin, thought he was honest and clever, and thought that he could deal with him, and Eisenhower and others agreed. What went on in Russia was not his concern, Truman declared. Stalin's death, he wrote in his diary, would be a real catastrophe. But he added a crucial footnote. Stalin-Russia cooperation was contingent on the U.S. getting its way 85% of the time. In short, as usual, the problem is not crimes, which can be as awesome as you like, but insubordination. That's a fact that has been made clear by a host of gangsters, from Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin up to Saddam Hussein. For such reasons, the U.S. had little interest in resolving the Cold War conflict. It's getting late, and I'll skip the history, but in fact it's true right up to the present. Unless you could return them to the service role. Short of that, no kind of settlement is even worth thinking about, and there were many opportunities. It's not in doubt any longer. The Soviet Union reached the peak of its power by the late 1950s, always far beyond the West. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet economy was stagnating, and standard social indicators were beginning to decline. By the late 1970s, military spending was flattening, and the autocracy was unable to control rising dissidents. The command economy had in fact carried out basic industrial development, but it was unable to proceed to more advanced stages, and it also suffered from the global recession that devastated much of the South. By the 1980s, the system collapsed, and the core industrial countries, which are always far richer and more powerful, won the Cold War. Much of the Soviet Empire will probably return to its traditional third world status, with the old Communist Party privileged class, the nomenklatura, taking on the role of third world elites linked to the international business and financial interests, which is in fact exactly what's going on right now. Throughout that period, great efforts were undertaken to present the Soviet Union as larger than life, about to overwhelm us. By the late 1970s, Soviet decline was absolutely unmistakable, but there was rising hysteria about the gargantuan Soviet system, leaping from strength to strength, straddling the globe, challenging the U.S., even threatening its survival, establishing positions of strength in Laos and Grenada and Mozambique and other such crucial centers of world strategic power. These delusionary efforts were accompanied by much fantasy about Soviet military spending, which have since been exposed as utterly false and quite likely outright fraud.
Seems to be accelerating.
Not too long, so I have to save you some other things. The collapse of the Soviet Empire offers quite a number of opportunities to Western power, along with the restoration of East Europe to the traditional service role. For one thing, it offers crucial opportunities to establish the North-South divide more firmly within the rich societies. one aspect of globalization of the economy is globalization of the third world two-tiered model. They go together, it's corollary. A couple of months ago, the chairman of Daimler-Benz warned, the huge German conglomerate, warned that if there were further strikes, the corporation would transfer manufacturing facilities elsewhere, in particular to Russia, with its ample supply of trained and healthy and, it is hoped, docile workers. The chairman of General Motors uses similar threats with regard to Mexico and other sectors of the third world, and incidentally Eastern Europe. There was a nice article about this in the Financial Times the other day, which pointed out that while GM plans to close 21 plants in the US and Canada, it has opened a huge $700 million assembly plant in East Germany with great expectations, heightened by the fact that thanks to over 40% unemployment, workers are willing, I'm quoting the Financial Times now, workers are willing to work longer hours than their pampered colleagues in Western Germany at 40% of the wage and with few benefits. The point is that capital can freely move, people can't, or in fact are not permitted to, by those who applaud Adam Smith's doctrines, which required free movement of labor, of course, apply them when it suits their fancy. The U.S. press also bitterly assailed the striking German workers last spring for what it called their soft life, long vacations, and general lack of understanding of their place as instruments for the rich and powerful. The idea is that they should learn the lessons that were taught at the same time to American workers by the Caterpillar Corporation. Profits and productivity were up, wages were down, the right to strike was eliminated by the resort to scabs, permanent replacement workers, returning the U.S. to the situation of a century ago when the admired philanthropist Andrew Carnegie destroyed this country's largest union at Homestead by bringing in scabs protected by the Pennsylvania National Guard. That victory enabled him to slash wages, impose 12-hour workdays, eliminate jobs, gain monumental profits. A magnificent record, it was called, that was to a great extent made possible by the company's victory at Homestead. It's a historian of the world's first billion-dollar corporation. The same victory cured the region of the dread threat of democracy, as working people were afraid to speak, let alone organize, for fear of being blacklisted and starvation, if not direct state violence, of which there was plenty. These conditions, in fact, were not overcome until the Great Depression, and they're now being restored. And so the world should run in accord with what Adam Smith called the vile maxim of the masters in one of his many denunciations of capitalism, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. This Caterpillar strike in 1992 is a historic event, as was the Homestead lockout a century earlier. It's the first time in 60 years that a major corporation has felt powerful enough to use the ultimate weapon against a very substantial union, the United Auto Workers in this case. These are the results of a fierce corporate campaign that was undertaken as soon as American workers finally won the right to organize in the mid-1930s after long years of bitter struggle and violent repression, which are completely unmatched in the industrial world. In fact, the violence was so extreme that it even scandalized journals like the London Times. You can draw your own conclusions from that. That victory for working people and for democracy sent a chill through the business community. The National Association of Manufacturers warned in 1938 of what it called the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses. Unless their thinking is directed, we are definitely headed for adversity. And a major counteroffensive was very quickly launched, accelerated after the elite concerns that were aroused by the crisis of democracy of the 1960s, and it has had quite significant success. The results of it are neatly captured in a New York Times headline a couple of weeks ago in the business section, which reads, "Paradox of 92, weak economy, strong profits." America is not doing very well, the article opens, but its corporations are doing just fine, with corporate profits hitting new highs as profit margins expand. It's a paradox, inexplicable, insoluble, and it's one that will only deepen as the architects of policy proceed without interference from meddlesome outsiders. What the paradox entails for the general population is demonstrated by numerous studies of income distribution, real wages, increasing poverty, including starvation, mortality, and so on, in cities and in rural areas that are coming to compare in these respects to the third world, and of course the world's richest country with extraordinary advantages. Overall, the 1980s have accelerated a global rift between a small sector enjoying great privilege and a growing mass of people who are suffering deprivation and misery. The internationalization of capital that accelerated since 1971, breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, also gives a rather new character to competition among national states. Just to cite one indication, the U.S. share in world exports of manufactures declined about 3.5% from 1966 to 1984, but the share of U.S.-based transnational corporations increased during this period. And international trade patterns reveal quite a different picture if imports from overseas subsidiaries are counted as domestic production. In fact, foreign affiliates increased their share of total exports of manufactures by U.S.-based firms from under 18% in 1957 to 41% in 1984. There's a 1992 World Bank study that reports that intra-firm trade, meaning centrally managed trade inside a particular firm, within the largest 350 transnational corporations contributed about 40% of total trade. Those are the islands in the alleged free trade sea. More than a third of U.S. trade is currently between foreign affiliates and their U.S.-based parents, that is, internally managed trade. And current figures are surely higher from these, which in fact are from a decade ago. As a social entity, the country and most of the population may decline, but the corporate empires are playing quite a different game, based on the theological doctrine that the masters have the right to make investment decisions unencumbered by the concerns of their servants in the workplace and the community. And with somewhere around maybe a third of world trade already conducted within North-based transnational corporations, these are factors of growing importance as we look forward toward year 501. The tendencies toward the new imperial age that are heralded by the international financial press are obvious and understandable, along with the corollary, the extension of the North-South divide to the inhabitants of the rich. But there are counter-tendencies. Throughout the North, notably in the United States, a great deal has changed in the last 30 years, at least in the cultural and moral spheres, if not at the institutional level. If the quincentennial of the old world order had fallen in 1962, it would have been celebrated once again as the liberation of the hemisphere. In 1992, that was impossible, just as no diplomatic historian today could write about our task of felling trees and Indians and get away with it. There's ample evidence also that Washington is well aware of the domestic constraints that virtually rule out state violence, traditional intervention. The ferment of the 1960s reached much wider circles in the years that followed. It elicited new sensitivity to racist and sexist oppression, to concern for the environment, respect for other cultures and human rights. One of the most striking examples is the Third World Solidarity movements of the 1980s, with their very broad social base, in fact right through Middle America in this case, and their unprecedented engagement in the lives and fate of the victims. That process of democratization and concern for social justice could have large significance. While these developments are perceived to be dangerous and subversive by the powerful, and they're bitterly denounced, as we read every day in the press and journals, and that too is understandable, these developments do threaten the vile maxim of the masters. And they also offer the only real hope for the great mass of the people in the world, even for the survival of the human species in an era of environmental and other global problems that cannot be faced by primitive social and cultural structures that are driven by short-term material gain and that regard human beings as mere instruments, not ends. Thank you.
not have a great deal more time in the hall, but there is just time to take one or two questions, and Noman's very kindly agreed to answer these. Before, just while you're thinking of what those might be, I have two announcements. One is that the Raymond Williams Trust will be organising next spring, around Easter time, a seminar on his work, including a seminar where themes connected with the nature of imperialism in the current world and the cultural distortions that has produced, work in the theme of books of his like The Country and the City, will be taken up and developed. If you're interested in this, could you please write to Graham Martin, Professor Graham Martin, at the Arts Faculty at the Open University, and you'll be sent further details. Also, if you're able to make any contribution to the Trust, that would be gratefully received, and you should send it to Professor Graham Martin at Arts Faculty, the Open University. And just another thing that I might observe is that I understand that Noam Chomsky will be interviewed by John Pilger on The Late Show this evening. That's right. So I'm sure your appetite has been whetted by this tremendous discourse, so pointed, so precise, such an indictment. Could I now ask for questions?
Well, that's the Lectures on Philosophy of History, his final work, you know, the summation of his thought, 1830, 1831. Is there a myth of the post-industrial society where you can produce very little, you can produce great wealth, but with little of the population productively employed? A great part of the population is productively employed. It's just employed in Papua New Guinea and high repression areas. The idea is to the effect of there has been, I mean, there's always been multinational corporations, you know, but there's been a very rapid acceleration since the breakdown of the international economic system in the early 70s. Very rapid acceleration. There are other factors that contributed to it too. So, and that's what's indicated in some of the statistics that I mentioned. So you now have internally managed trade in a kind of corporate mercantilism, as it's sometimes called, where the labor is moved to high repression areas. So that you don't have to worry about those pampered workers at home, as the Financial Times puts it. And in fact, this is a shift. It is a kind of, I don't know if post-industrial is the right term, but there is a shift of model. I mean, there was a kind of a Henry Ford-style model, where the idea was production was basically, the economy was more or less national, not totally, of course, but more or less national. And that meant you had to have consumers to keep profits up. So Ford innovated the idea of paying workers enough so that they could buy something, and that would enable manufacturers to make profits. Now, I think there's a shift away from that towards production by workers who don't have to buy anything, because they're mostly either in the third world or in the third world that's coming back at home in the United States and to a certain extent in Britain, where you can have high repression, unorganized workers who really are not, and they're never going to organize because you kill the organizers or something like that. And if they try, you just bring in others who will replace them because there's a huge overflow as you drive people off the land and so on. Now, they're never going to be consumers, so who are going to be the consumers? Well, in the internationalized economy, there are rich sectors everywhere, fairly substantial rich sectors in the industrial societies, and smaller but not insubstantial rich sectors in the third world. So, you go to a typical third world country, say Brazil, after this great, success story for capitalism, and say 5% of the population or something like that live at approximately the level of, Western European elites, richer sometimes. And, 80% live like, Central Africa. Now, in a rich society like, say, the United States, the proportions will be different, of course, but the structure is becoming more or less the same. And the idea is that the poor people everywhere will be the wealth producers, and the rich people everywhere will be the consumers, and the domestic societies, the domestic countries will be essentially police forces controlling their own populations, while the major decisions about the world economy and world society are made by the international corporations and financial institutions and the de facto world government, which is growing in a quite natural way to reflect their interests. That's the new imperial age of the Financial Times. The decisions are raised to the level of supranational institutions where parliaments can't influence them and citizens don't know about them. The problem with parliaments is that although they're more or less controlled by the same interests, they are to a limited extent subject to the influence of the rabble. And you want to eliminate that as you destroy democracy totally, which in fact has always been the aim of elites. I mean, there are kind of dreamy fantasies going around about history with a capital H converging to a liberal democratic order. I mean, this isn't even fantasy. Continuing Chinese occupation of Tibet, yeah, it's an atrocity, but we ought to look at its history, in fact. Why does China occupy Tibet? Well, one reason is because in the 1920s and the 1930s, the Western imperial powers insisted that China occupy Tibet. They wanted China to dominate the surrounding areas, Tibet, Manchuria, and Mongolia, because it was assumed that China's in our pocket. China's been open to Western exploitation ever since the British opened it up in the Opium War, forcing them to take British lethal narcotics because there was nothing else they wanted. And ever since then, China's been a plaything for the West, and it was assumed in the 1930s that that was going to continue, so therefore China ought to be as large as possible to be a proper market, and therefore the West insisted on something which was by no means natural, namely that Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet be incorporated within China. Well, later something happened in China that the West didn't like that much, but they were stuck with what they had achieved. But yes, it's an atrocity, like most
clubs and hand actions. Sheep shoots.
Yeah, I meant to. Yeah, well, at the end, very rapidly, so much so that she almost missed it. She thought she caught a note of something positive. And actually, that's extremely important. I mean, the United States, and in fact much of the world, is completely different culturally and morally than it was 30 years ago. The effects of the 60s revolutions were enormous. I mean, you see them in every imaginable respect. And the rulers are terrified of it. I mean, that's why you have these tantrums now in the press about what they call political correctness. They're sort of right. You know, there are a lot of people around who don't believe in racist oppression and in sexist oppression and who have respect for other cultures and think you ought to care about other people and who are opposed to
there's a
violent
sheriff
aggression.
from a nearby
Well,
our
like
patrols have made some of the bandits go
I mean, all of
elsewhere.
these monsters are in fact running around. That wasn't a problem 30 years ago.
The
They
bandits
weren't
have
running
raided
around.
our village
But now they're
twice.
there, so
First time
naturally
just
the
to steal
commissar
our
class is
pigs.
becoming
So Leaves
hysterical.
wants us to send regular.
Your
They
Lady
tried
Kana
very
has the
hard to
straight
get
of
rid
it.
of
We
them, and
send
they
men
can't.
over there.
I mean, take say
Those
the
are men
Vietnam
we
War.
won't have for our own
For the last
patrols, and the
30 years,
decision
there's been
is yours.
unremitting propaganda in the United States to portray the Vietnam War, and in fact the whole history, as an atrocity by the
Sending half on
Vietnamese
that?
against suffering Americans.
I hope you've
I
made-
gave a couple of samples, but it's uniform. And if you sample the educated classes, everybody sees it like that. You go to the general population, and they're totally out of control. There's regular polls, because business wants to keep its finger on the public pulse, so you know how to do propaganda and stuff. The latest on this issue, 1990, 70% of the population, 71% of the population regards the war, given a set of choices, as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. Among educated sectors, it's statistically undetectable, such a position. And that 70% of the population is people who have never heard it expressed. Everybody who answers that question must think I'm the only person in the world who thinks this, because they certainly never read it anywhere. All they read is it was a noble cause that went awry and maybe became a mistake and so on, but nobody believes it. The population is just out of control. And it's the same on every issue. I mean, when Anita Hill brought her charges, the whole thing turned into a catastrophe. But just imagine what would have happened if Anita Hill had brought those charges forward 30 years ago. I mean, nobody would even bother to laugh, you know. I mean, yeah, sure, that's what things are supposed to be like. Well, now the Senate tried to suppress it, but they couldn't. You know, it leaked out, and they had to pretend to face it. Of course they didn't, but they had to pretend, because the population is like that. And it's like that on every issue. In fact, just the day of the opening of the ground campaign in Iraq, there was a leak of a very interesting document. It was hidden, but it was there. It was interesting, a Bush administration planning document from the early days of the Bush administration. And here's what it said. It said, in the case of confrontation with much weaker enemies, meaning anybody that we're willing to fight. You obviously don't fight anybody who's going to shoot back. If you want to, what's called a military hero is somebody who sits in an air-conditioned office somewhere, shuffling around papers while his troops murder people who can't shoot back. That's the definition of a hero, like Norman Schwarzkopf, the British equivalent, whose name I've forgotten. So in the case of much weaker enemies, it says we must not only defeat them, but defeat them rapidly and decisively, because anything else will undercut political support, recognized to be completely thin. Now, you know, there is a traditional pattern of intervention. It goes way back. Traditional intervention means you send the Marines to occupy Haiti for 20 years, or to chase Sandino around in the hills forever, you know, or you send, like you do, like John F. Kennedy did, you send the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam to smithereens. That's traditional intervention. It's not even an option anymore. I mean, the only options today are clandestine warfare, which is, clandestine means secret from the population at home. Clandestine warfare is just a sign of fear of the population. It's not secret from anybody else. You know, think about what clandestine operations are. They're not secret to the victims, you know, they're not secret to the big network of states around the world who are participating in them. In fact, they aren't even secret from the press, except they're low enough levels they can pretend not to know it. They're secret from the domestic population, and you only resort to inefficient clandestine terror if more efficient direct terror is not available. That's why there was such a sharp increase in complexity of clandestine terror during the Reagan years. They know the population won't accept it. So that's one option. And the other is rapid, decisive victories over much weaker enemies when you're guaranteed that they're not going to shoot back. And those are the only options. The so-called war in the Gulf, which was not a war, of course. A war means you got two sides shooting at each other. The Gulf slaughter, as we ought to call it, met those conditions. First, you demonize the enemy, you terrorize the American population. Then you go in very fast, destroy everybody and with a guarantee that no one will shoot back, and that you can get away with. But that's, you know, not nice for the victims, but it's a very sharp narrowing of the options, and this is true of everything. The quincentennial is a very dramatic example. When they were planning the quincentennial, they were planning a celebration of liberation. There was so much popular protest, they had to back off. It then became an encounter. It was about as much of an encounter as the encounter between the Germans and the Jews in Europe in the 1940s, and plenty of the population understands that too. So the whole thing just collapsed to many. You know. Well, that's a sign of cultural improvement. It's even reached the educated sectors to a limited extent. So, for example, up until the 1960s, remarkable but true, up until the 1960s, even scholarship, you know, anthropologists and people like that, were completely suppressing the history of what happened in the United States. I mean, it was possible for a leading diplomatic historian to talk about felling trees and Indians, and nobody batted an eyelid. Felling trees and Indians. Now it's impossible. They had to start telling the truth about what happened, which was, of course, mass genocide. And it's not that they found new evidence. You know, the evidence was always around. It was just suppressed. And it's coming out, and there's a fair amount of understanding. And that's true of lots of other areas. You know, that's really important. Those are tremendous changes. Now, they have no institutional reflection. You know, the great genius of American and British society has been to isolate individuals enough, to make people so isolated, you know, that they can't do anything. Okay? Okay, they're all sitting there somewhere. You may have seen this the other day. There was a study of the European community, you know, life patterns, how long do people sleep, and all that kind of thing. And one of the questions they asked is how long people watch TV. Britain broke the record. You know, 90% of the population, I think it was 4.5 hours a day of TV watching. Well, that's the perfect way to isolate people. You can have complete freedom, you know, everything, all democratic rights, absolutely perfect, as long as every person is glued to the tube, you know, so you can't talk to anybody and you can't get together and you can't pool your resources. You may have your own crazy ideas in your head, you know, like in your own head you think, yeah, the Vietnam War was an atrocity, but as long as that happens, you can have democratic forms, and that's what's being achieved in the advanced industrial societies. That's what's being called the triumph of liberal democracy. But, you know, it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, unions and other popular organizations were created in the past under much more violent and repressive conditions than exist today, with a lot of struggle, and it can be done again. And you don't have to have the vile maxim of the masters that Adam Smith deplored. Not necessary. You can go after the core issue, which classical liberalism also deplored, namely wage labor, which was regarded as an atrocity by classical liberals in the 18th century, if you look back. Yeah, you can go after that too. This is another form of oppression and autocracy. There are lots of possibilities if these broadly based popular movements can manage to overcome the fact that they don't have resources and that they are scattered and that they're isolated and have very little ways of communicating with one another and so on. Sure, it can happen.
It is amazing to me that I did not loot him the first time.
Yeah.
Or that.
So in other words, without the prop of anti-communism, which has been the basis for the propaganda system for actually 70 years, how can paper, I think you mentioned The Independent, but in fact any paper, continue to localize the atrocities on some particular enemy? Okay. Well, you know, the same way they did before 1917. There actually was a history before 1917, and if you look back, it was the same. You know? I mean, nothing happened during the Cold War except new pretexts. I mean, new methods of mobilizing people. Say, take the United States, which I know better than England, so I'll take the United States. When Woodrow Wilson sent the Marines to occupy Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which was no joke, incidentally. You know, they massacred people, they reinstated slavery. As I mentioned, they threw out the constitutional system and sold the country off to American plantations. It has yet to escape. That's the reason why Haiti and the Dominican Republic are still horror chambers. They're pretty rich countries. When he did that, there were no Bolsheviks around. It was 1915 and 1916. So he was defending the U.S. from the Huns. Before that, the U.S. Navy was defending the United States from Chile, believe it or not, in the 1890s. Before that, it was mainly defending them from England. And the way, if you want to understand how these things work, you ought to look at the U.S. record on England. England was despised. You know, it was regarded as much worse than the treatment of Russia. This goes way back to the late 18th century. The idea expressed by the founding fathers, John Adams and others, was that England will always be our enemy until we are her master. The takeover of Texas, when the U.S. took Texas under the Jacksonian Democrats, the major motive was to try to monopolize cotton. Cotton was, in those days, like oil is today. You know, it was the main commodity in world trade, and it's what got it was the main factor in the Industrial Revolution. So the idea was that if the United States could control. Britain was very strong there. Like the British fleet was a deterrent. The U.S. couldn't conquer Cuba, couldn't invade Canada, all these things it wanted to do because the British power was too great. The idea was that if the U.S. could monopolize the production of cotton, which they figured they could do if they took Texas, we can not only bring England to our feet, but we can bring the entire world to our feet. The worst charges against Saddam Hussein were in fact real about the Jacksonian Democrats in the 1840s, if you look back. And it was mainly England that was the enemy that we had to defend ourselves against. Actually, this led to some more comical examples, too, if you like. Thomas Jefferson, back around 1785, was trying to figure out, 1790 and so on, was trying to figure out what it was that made the English character so insusceptible to civilization, as he put it. And he decided the problem, he was a scientist, but he decided that the problem was probably that the English ate too much animal food. And he therefore concluded that maybe the solution would be in their kitchens, not in their churches, as he put it. And in fact, a couple of years later, he strongly supported the French. He was hoping the French would conquer England, presumably assuming that would improve the cuisine as well as the character. And it just goes on from there. So Britain was the enemy, which inspired even more hatred probably than Russia today. Incidentally, this was reciprocated, except in the case of the British attitude toward the United States, it was contempt rather than, fear. So, for example, just to give you one example, in I guess around 1870 or so, some rich benefactor offered Cambridge University a bequest for a lectureship in American studies, which is kind of like as if somebody offered them a bequest, and I don't know. Can't think of an example, so absurd. Nobody could imagine why you should study this. But he offered them a bequest in American studies, and the idea was that every other year they should get a Harvard professor over to talk about colonial culture over there. And there was a big debate about it in Cambridge. They finally voted it down. And the fear was that if they brought a professor from Harvard, you got to read this to believe it, he would stir up subversion among the undergraduates. And in fact, one of the Dons, one of my favorite lines, how did he put it? He said, if we do this, there's going to be a biennial flash of transatlantic darkness. And they weren't going to take any chances with this, so they turned it down. So the problem went both ways. But it's never hard to conjure up enemies. You go back to the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the most disgraceful documents on record. The founding fathers were describing how they were defending themselves against the merciless Indian savages whose known way of warfare is to massacre women and children. Okay, maybe by the 1950s people had forgotten it, but they knew the truth. They knew that it was the merciless European savages who had to teach the native people the European way of warfare, namely you wait till the men leave the village and then you go in and you slaughter the women and the children. They knew it because they were doing it, but they could say it anyway. And in fact, we've been able to read it for 200 years without batting an eyelash over it. So, conjuring up enemies is a job that the commissars are very good at.
Now, I also want to talk about the deep genealogy of wage labor as part 2. In this essay, I want to pursue the relation of debt and commoditization of labor by looking at the history of the wage relations. Considering the dominance of the wage system today, it's actually remarkably angular research. There's a lot of studies of slavery. Just compare how many studies of slavery there are, how many studies of wage labor in antiquity or Middle Ages. You realize, okay, it's true, slavery was actually a more important institution, but it's just like 50 to 1. There's enormous amounts of one, and surprisingly little on the other. I can't think of a single book-length study, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, about forms of wage contract in the ancient or medieval world. And insofar as information about wage contracts is to be found, it's largely inside the literature that's about slavery. And that's, of course, significant in itself, since for most of history, the two institutions were, in fact, closely related.
Explains why he looks so much like David
It's
Graeber.
well documented in ancient Greece, although I think often people draw the wrong conclusions. Essentially, Jonathan Friedman came to the famous conclusion that ancient Greek slavery was really a form of capitalism. I would rather make the argument that capitalism is really a transformation of slavery. But it is certainly certain that slaves and wage laborers were essentially overlapping categories in most of ancient Greek history. The freeborn Athenian and Corinthian, for that matter, of the 4th or 5th centuries BC didn't consider, being paid to work for a government as in any way shameful. Right? That's because if it's one's own government, one is essentially working for oneself. If one's doing jury duty or building a monument. Athens wasn't considered an abstraction. Athens, there was the Athenians. So I'm an Athenian, I'm working for the Athenians, I'm working for myself. Even hiring oneself out as a mercenary to a foreign potentate, which was an honorable thing to do. However, hiring oneself out to a private citizen in the same community was totally different. And people really avoided that because it essentially marks you as a slave. As a result, almost all early wage labor contracts that we're aware of appear to have, in fact, been contracts for slave rental. These arrangements could, as Friedman pointed out, be quite sophisticated, involving the allocation of money wages split between slave and owner to workers maintained in workshops producing for the market. In many ways, they did approximate what we're used to thinking of as capitalist arrangements, but they were an extension of the institution of slavery itself. Now, some of the world systems theorists have generalized from this. Chase, Dunn, and Hall, in their book Rise and Demise, argue that capitalism, and like most world systems analysts, are defining capitalism in Brodelian terms, as basically use of money to make more money. Capitalism, they say, tends to develop within what they call autonomous capitalist city-states on the semi-peripheries of world systems. The examples they give are Dildon, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, Malacca, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Antwerp, and the cities of the Hanseatic League. Even that point is actually an extension of something that a point Brodel had made, that if capitalism can only emerge if merchants and financiers are able to ally themselves with governments, then small mercantile states is where that's most likely to happen. What's interesting for my own purposes is that these are also the kind of places where one is historically most likely to encounter the densest concentrations of chattel slaves, even in periods where chattel slavery had largely been eliminated elsewhere, such as the Middle Ages. And also particularly as a factor of production. So it's those areas where you find sort of nascent capitalists sort of allying with or taking over governments. That's the place where you see the most chattel slaves, but it's also where you see something that resembles wage labor emerging from within the institution of slavery in much the way as you saw happen in ancient Greece. And I think historians have largely missed this because if you look at the exceptions to this, they're mostly in Northern Europe. European mercantile city-states were somewhat anomalous in this regard. Southern Europe actually still fits the pattern fairly well. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa were not only centers of commerce and finance, as we know, they were precisely the part of medieval Europe where slavery, classic chattel slavery, held on the longest. It's true it was contested. In the 12th century, for example, the slaves that had been employed making cloth by monasteries in Venice were largely replaced by guild labor. Actually, this is across Italy. After that, Italian slaves were rarely employed for producing for the market. But that's largely because that was around the time that the use of servile labor for producing for the market shifted away from Italy itself to what were essentially colonial possessions, particularly sugar plantations in Crete and Cyprus, in what many believe provided the model that was later exported first to the Canary Islands and then to the Caribbean. I think all of this happened because in Europe, much unlike the rest of the mercantile city-states elsewhere in the world at that time, almost all of which were part of the larger Islamic ecubine, if you want to call it that, where Islam and Islamic law was sort of medium of trade, or arbiter of trade, and enforce a strict division between war and commerce. In Europe, war and commerce was kind of mixed together in a way that really didn't happen elsewhere. Talk about this a bit in the debt book, which is why there's an exploitation of servile labor for market purposes by either funded by or directly by mercantile city-states tended to happen as part of military and colonial ventures, whereas such things in other places happen within the city-states themselves. If you go back to the trading world during the same period, one finds with remarkable consistency labor arrangements similar to those of the ancient world, where it's actually almost entirely slaves who are doing wage labor. Insofar as you observe wage labor contracts, they are actually slave rentals. Either because the owners would rent their slaves out directly, or because slaves who had achieved a certain amount of autonomy would be allowed to find work on their own and then be expected to turn over a share of the proceeds to their owners.
A critic of secrecy and conspiratorial attitudes on the part of governments. But can you take us beyond this negative appraisal and offer some practical principles for reform? Or in other words, is there a form of government which you believe is deserving of our trust?
I think that's several different. First of all, I don't accuse anybody of conspiratorial behavior. Conspiracy is a funny word. It's used. We don't talk about it as conspiracy when we say that the Politburo met and decided to do something. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just rational analysis. The term conspiracy is used to try to undercut rational analysis of our own planning system. So there's nothing conspiratorial about the fact that U.S. planners decided to do something. That's their job. It's not conspiratorial. They have a commitment to keep the public from knowing, and that's understandable too. In fact, to a substantial extent, the media have the same commitment. I've documented it quite substantially. And it's fear of democracy, primarily, which lies behind it. But then, turn to your point, are there practical proposals? Is there a form of government we can trust? There are plenty of practical proposals. In fact, I've been talking about practical proposals in one case. And we can go case by case and find lots of cases of practical proposals. They all ultimately rely on the same thing. People, human beings, can figure out what their values are, and they're usually pretty much the same. And then they can ask how they can pressure the various systems of authority in which they live to act in accordance with those principles. Now, we're pretty lucky. Those are free and democratic societies, so you can pressure systems of authority without ending up in a ditch, cut to pieces, and after hideous torture. So we're lucky. We have all sorts of ways of doing it. Other people aren't so lucky. They have harder ways of doing it, and they try. And it's astonishing that they do more than we do under our easy circumstances. So, like say George Adejandro has a much harder time than we do, but he's outspoken. When you ask, is there a form of government we can trust? No, by definition. There is no form of authority that ever ought to be trusted. You don't trust, and that ought to be second nature. You don't trust authority. What you do is challenge authority. You ask authority to justify itself. Well, maybe sometimes it can justify itself. So, okay. If it can't, dismantle. But certainly don't trust it. You don't trust anybody but yourself.
There's been a lot of talk recently about video games. This, again, really? Is this really what we're supposed to be thinking about right now? Is this what the fucking President of the United States is concerned about? This? This is what you're concerned about? Not the fact that you ignore your own advisors to keep more power to yourself. The fact that you brag about having less than half approval rate, despite somehow winning an election with fewer votes than your opponent. Not the fact that states are restricting the rights of minorities, restricting voter freedom to the point of them not even being democracies anymore. The fact that ICE is behaving in a way that reminds me as an historian about the Nazi secret police, especially considering the fact that they're targeting refugees and minorities and breaking many human rights as they do so. Yeah, let's talk about that instead. But what about leftist Obama? Didn't he deport more than most US presidents in
I was wondering
history?
where the hell this
Isn't
came from.
he a fascist by your logic? I mean, of course Trump doesn't care about this. His policy is the closest thing to fascism you can get in a major democratic state these days. Before I start this rant, I want to make sure that you know that I haven't really been to America. I'm not an American, as you can probably hear from my accent, and I don't really know how the American police system works, because I haven't been subjected to it. So take this with a grain of salt, okay? However, I think that the perspective of an outsider can be really useful to you. At least that's what I hope. And also, Americans, I'm talking to you directly right now. I know that you probably know way better than me the horrors that ICE put you through, but I think that maybe an outside perspective can, I don't know, shine some light on it. But of course, I am an outsider, so I will defer to you on basically everything you say. Now, my idea that ICE is a fascist organization is not really a new one. It's been around since the foundation of ICE. But why do people think that? Well, it all comes down to the role that ICE plays in deporting people. ICE is the organization that grabs people from the street, outside of the courtroom, just in their homes, and deports them to another country, usually by having them sometime interned in a camp before. And you can already see where I'm going with this. And when I talk about fascist secret police, you know how most countries, like when you read on their Wikipedia page, they have like, oh, they would make people report on each other, schoolmates reporting schoolmates, families reporting families. Well, ICE has that. They have one of those hotlines. Like, what the fuck? It's not report a crime, it's report a person. That's insane to me. Can you imagine schoolmates reporting on each other to fucking ICE? That's horrifying to me. ICE also does raids on legal businesses without a warrant, into families' homes, and just sometimes on the street. And they do this with the sole purpose of grabbing people, putting them in camp, and deporting them. It's a wonder to me how anyone can see this system and not think of a fascist police state. When I was in 2nd grade, this is the shit people told me that Nazis did. And as I studied history, I learned how they did that and more things that are similar to ICE. Whoa, okay. ICE isn't committing genocide. Okay, whoa, I get it. ICE isn't committing genocide, but maybe we shouldn't draw the line of fascism at genocide. Maybe we should work a bit sooner before that. Like the drawing should be like drawn at racial profiling and like before we get to the extermination camps. Maybe we should have higher standards than that.
14,000 gold, but I don't think it's going to be enough for the very best of them.
What ICE is doing is detaining people for the sole crime of being in a country where they're not supposed to be, as well as subjecting the people detained to gross human rights violations, ranging from sexual assault to just death. Like, you see this? This is the shit you see on dictator Wikipedia pages, not a law enforcement agency. This is absurd to me. You're supposed to be the fucking beacon of democracy, of freedom and liberty, and this is what you do? Really? The people that ICE are deporting are illegal aliens, which to me sounds like a horrifying term for a person. The term is meant to dehumanize human beings, and it most certainly does. And dehumanizing people is something that fascists do. The crime that these people have committed is being born in one place and currently being in another, without some forms being filled out. Like, how is that a crime? Most of these people that ICE are detaining haven't committed a crime. They're law-abiding people. They're not law-abiding citizens, but they're law-abiding. They haven't hurt anyone. In many cases, they are contributing to the economy and to their communities. They haven't committed any hurt to anyone. They haven't committed a crime. Like, why? I know I sound like a Tumblr SJW princess here. I get it. But maybe we shouldn't detain people that haven't hurt anyone. Like, that's just a suggestion. Maybe we shouldn't grab people off the street for the crime of existing. Maybe. And also, hear me out. Is it really worth spending that much money to get these people into the internment camps and deporting them? Like I said, in many cases they are contributing to the economy and their communities. And you are spending $5.4 billion on this agency. That's a lot of money being spent on deporting people that are contributing to the economy, which means that the money that they would have made, that's also lost from the economy, so it's probably more than $5.4 billion. That's a lot of money that you're losing right there, along with like human beings that deserve, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and stuff like that, as well as just, I don't know, human beings. Like, what have you gained from deporting people that haven't committed a crime, that hasn't done any hurt? Like, what do you gain from that? What do you gain from deporting people who haven't committed a crime or haven't committed any hurt on anyone? Has the world become a better place with people torn from their families, from their communities, and placed in countries where they might not have any connections, might not have a family or a community? Has the world become better than that? Tell me, person who's watching this, and maybe believe that ice is good. What good has come from that? Now, I care about people. I like to think I do anyway. If someone hasn't harmed anyone, then I can't really see a reason for disliking them. A lot of the people that ICE are detaining and putting into internment camps haven't done any harm, so why should we do anything then? Even if you're not on board with open borders, you should still see that the way they're doing things now is weird, it's strange, it's oppressive, and it's cruel. Now, I am on board for open borders, which is, you know, but that's a story for another time. My position is that almost every American president has been a fascist to some degree, but the way people are discussing ICE has really changed, and it is changing in a very scary way, not just in the US. As an historian, I know that history is written by the victors, but what that really means can be hard to understand sometimes. If the things that happen in America right now would happen in any non-Western country, America would probably denounce that country and put sanctions on them. But it's somehow okay when the US does it. And it's not just ICE. The entire idea of deportation has very fascist undertones. The concept of illegals infects the police, how they work, it affects everyone who's working within ICE, and it affects mainstream politics. Donald Trump himself speaks of illegals and Mexicans as if there's some kind of plague and not human beings.
It's not only Mexico. If you let that run a little bit longer, it talks about people coming from all over. They're coming from all over. They'll soon be coming, and probably already have be coming from all over the world. You're probably going to have people, you're probably going to have terrorists coming from the Middle East. Somebody said, oh, we don't have terrorists. They don't even know, because they don't know who's coming. So we have this open border. It's a sieve. It's like water pouring through. People are coming in by the hundreds of thousands.
Who the fuck does he know what a sieve is?
We have no idea who's coming in. And it's not just Mexican.
And ICE operates everywhere, often in conjunction with local police. And the really scary thing here is the timeline. I often suggest abolishing ICE, but the defense I often hear of ICE is that ICE has been a law enforcement institution for decades, and we can't take away this essential part of law enforcement. But that's not true. ICE has existed for 15 years. It's not decades, it's decades. The agency didn't even exist before 2003. And America wasn't some kind of Mad Max style of wasteland before 2003. And isn't that the era that these MAGA right-wingers want to return to? Like a world without ICE? And yet they are the ones who are the most staunch defenders of ICE.
So
And in just 15 years they have been able to do all these things. That's horrifying
Let
to me.
us see if what
This
I
isn't
seek
some
is
legacy from the
here as
1800s.
well.
This is things that are happening now, in our lifetimes. And if
there
all
goes.
these things are happening now, in a very short time span, I can see things going better with ICE. I can't really see ICE being reformed into some good law enforcement agency, because they have been rotten from the start.
We have arrived. I can still feel the touch of Ilfarn around us and beneath us. Know that we must find the 5 statues of Angarad if we
And
are
I
to
know,
complete
I sound
the
a bit
ritual
extreme
of
here, but how
purification.
can't I?
These statues
Criticizing
are
ICE is
within
something
these
that is
without
fairly
undergoing the
easy
ritual
to
we
do,
cannot
considering
defeat
all
the
of these
King
things
of
that I have done.
Shadows.
I don't
We
think
must
that I'm a
make
left-wing
haste.
extremist,
The
just
sooner
the
we
thought
can-
of having that you shouldn't deport people who haven't done any harm. Although I am a left-wing extremist. But ICE doesn't just target immigrants. They also target refugees, political opponents, and sometimes US citizens. Imagine 1 in 30 people being deported just being a US citizen. Because that's what's happening, that's what they're doing. ICE isn't even supposed to do anything to US citizens. And despite that, they are. And seeing that, it seems like they can just take anyone they want. Many people also witness to that sometimes ICE agents identify themselves as local law enforcement. Another common strategy is just to round up as many people as you can and process them later. Detain first, ask questions later. And that's not how law enforcement is supposed to work. So they detain first, ask questions later, and falsely identify themselves as the local police, which kind of means that they are a form of secret police. You know, the thing dictators usually have. This all seems cruel to me. And it doesn't seem like ICE is doing anything positive for anyone. And I haven't even mentioned the racial profiling that ICE usually uses in the way they operate. Many people witness ICE performing racial profiling, as well as grabbing people outside of immigration courts. Isn't that thought just terrifying? Imagine that you are in a courtroom, defending your right to be in the country, and as you step out of the court, they take you and arrest you. You can't have a fair trial in that circumstance. So let's go through the things that they do. They operate in the entire US, they identify themselves as local law enforcement, they use racial profiling, they abduct political opponents, perform raids without warrants, sometimes deport US citizens, make local law enforcement cooperate with them, subject detainees to inhuman conditions, and operate with the oversight of a person who only wants to make their country return to a glory that they've never really had. Like, how is that not fascist? Remember when the right hated walls and tightly enforced borders?
What are you attacking?
Well, here's the thing. Many local governments oppose the way ICE operates and are trying to work against them. And in a democratic society, this should be seen as a good thing. Sometimes ICE argues that the local politicians who oppose them should be arrested for the crimes of undocumented immigrants. That's not fair, that's not democratic, that's not how a law enforcement agency should work, because that's not how the law works. And ICE still operate in cities where they have limited jurisdiction, performing raids and arresting people.
In ancient times, Guardian was created to protect the farm.
Christ,
If
I don't
the
know how
time
to
has
do it.
come, instrument,
It's depressing, that's what it
you will
is.
be an agent of its destruction.
Call your
Take this blessing
politicians,
of
hold them
camaraderie.
accountable, I guess.
May its power strike down
Donald
all
Trump is
who
president, how
oppose
can you even
and
do
their
anything?
allies.
The message I have? Abolish ICE. And make no compromises there. Don't abolish ICE and then make
The
some
first
new
part of the
border
ritual
enforcement
is
agency or
complete.
some shit
Our
like that.
enemy's home is everywhere
Abolish
darkness
ICE
lies.
totally. There can be no compromise there. The thing is, I don't really know how police in America works. I once occupied a government building in Sweden with no consequences.
Know that though the
and
King
I
of
don't
Shadows
think
may
American
become
politics
legions,
really would
this
agree
ritual
with
may
that.
still be used
I guess
to
this is the
drive
part where
him
the
back.
left-wing extremists would argue for a violent revolution or something like that. Maybe that would work. Who knows? Hey, thanks for watching the video. And if you enjoy my content, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. That really means a lot to me. That means that it lets me know that you enjoy my content. And I would also enjoy
How do I add it to this stupid thing?
you can leave a comment. If you really like my content and you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon. I also want to give a special shout out to Ibrahim Aldridge. Your support really means a lot to me. Thank you.
I also probably have a blessing of clean somehow.
A critic of secrecy and conspiratorial attitudes on the part of government. But can you take us beyond this negative appraisal and offer some practical principles for reform? Or in other words, is there a form of government which you believe is deserving of our trust?
I think that's several different. First of all, I don't accuse anybody of conspiratorial behavior. Conspiracy is a funny word. You know, it's used we don't talk about it as conspiracy when we say that the Politburo met and decided to do something. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just rational analysis. The term conspiracy is used to try to undercut rational analysis of our own planning system. So there's nothing conspiratorial about the fact that U.S. planners decided to do something. That's their job. It's not conspiratorial. They have a commitment to keep the public from knowing, and that's understandable too. In fact, to a substantial extent, the media have the same commitment. I've documented it quite substantially. And it's fear of democracy, primarily. I think that's what lies behind it. But then, turn to your point, are there practical proposals? Is there a form of government we can trust? There are plenty of practical proposals. In fact, I've been talking about practical proposals in one case, and we can go case by case and find lots of cases of practical proposals. They all ultimately rely on the same thing. People, human beings, can figure out what their values are, and they're usually pretty much the same. And then they can ask how they can pressure the various systems of authority in which they live to act in accordance with those principles. Now, we're pretty lucky. These are free and democratic societies, so you can pressure systems of authority without ending up in a ditch, cut to pieces, and, after hideous torture. So we're lucky. We have all sorts of ways of doing it. Other people aren't so lucky. They have harder ways of doing it, and they try. And, it's astonishing that they do more than we do under our easy circumstances. So, like, say, George Adejandro has a much harder time than we do, but he's outspoken, When you ask, is there a form of government we can trust? No, by definition. There is no form of authority that ever ought to be trusted, You don't trust, and that ought to be second nature. You don't trust authority. What you do is challenge authority. You ask authority to justify itself. Well, maybe sometimes it can justify itself. If so, okay. If it can't, dismantle it. But certainly don't trust it. You don't trust anybody but yourself.
And where did the money come from, in case you're wondering? In the 1930s, in the depths of a depression, when the government didn't have money, how could it pay for Social Security, unemployment compensation, and hiring 15 million unemployed people, paying them? And the answer was that Roosevelt taxed corporations and the rich. That's right. He taxed corporations and the rich. And that's how he paid for it. The result for him as a politician, Roosevelt, was that he was reelected 3 times across the 1930s. He was the most popular president in the history of the United States because he was the one who went after corporations and the rich to help average people. But he didn't do it because of him. If you look at his entire political history before he became president, he was no radical, he was no left-winger, he was a conventional rich kid. Went to school in the right universities of Harvard and Yale, etc., etc. He was pushed from below, and you know what pushed him? The coalition of communists, socialists, and unionists. So when World War II was over, 1945, and when in the same year President Roosevelt died in his 4th term, well, the business community that was enraged that they had to pay those taxes to help average people, they went to work. And they understood the problem wasn't defeating a Democrat and bringing in a Republican. They knew very well that Roosevelt didn't do this because he thought it was a good idea. They understood he had been pressured from below by that coalition of unionists, socialists, and communists to do what he did. So they understood that to roll it back, to break it down, and to make sure that never happened again, they had to destroy that coalition. And the way you do that, the way you destroy any coalition, is you look for and focus first on the weakest link among the groups that are making up the coalition. And they determined in 1945 that the weak link were the communists, the Communist Party. So overnight, the Communist Party and its activists, who had been leaders of the unionization movement in many industries, who had been leaders in the struggle against fascism in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, became overnight not leaders, not heroes, but demons. They were converted into agents of a foreign power, the Soviet Union. Kind of remarkable if you remember that in the previous 45 years, from 1940 to 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies in a war against fascism in Germany, Italy, and Japan. That soldiers from Russia and America worked together with the same objectives in a coordinated struggle. They were our friends, our allies, our supporters. Suddenly, they had to be turned into arch enemies. And so in the aftermath of World War II, after the death of Roosevelt, we had in America a political purge, really of the kind you rarely see in the world and like nothing else in American history. The government, big business, and conservatives everywhere went on a tear to arrest communists. Many were to deport many of them back to countries they had left sometime 40 years earlier, to demonize them as evil agents of a foreign power, not leaders of an effort that had succeeded in giving average Americans the benefit of government programs, the likes of which had never happened before in American history. And, footnote, never happened again since then either.
Well, on Sunday, Democracy Now! Traveled about an hour west to a 12,000-year-old forest in western Germany where activists are fighting against the largest open-pit coal mine in Europe. The massive Hambach mine is 33 square miles, half the size of Washington, D.C. It extracts an extremely dirty form of coal called lignite, also known as brown coal, which causes the highest CO2 emissions, that's carbon dioxide emissions, of any type of coal when burned. For more than 5 years, activists have been fighting to shut down the mine and to save the remaining forest from being cut down to make way for the expanding project. Only 10% of the ancient forest remains. Well, on Sunday, we drove down a dirt road. We got caught in the mud, had to push our car out, but we there bumped into an activist from the nearby city of Cologne at the entrance to the remaining forest.
My name is Anna Fries.
And tell us where we are right now.
Yeah, we are in the Rhineland in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, and we have one of the biggest coal mine areas here in the Rhineland with a lot of bad emissions for, well, all of us. And
is this one of the largest coal pits in Europe?
I think it's the largest one with the most emission. And as you can see here on the photo, we're in this area at the moment, and all of this was nature, was the forest.
You're showing us a map.
And yeah, it's basically 90% of the forest is destroyed already because of the coal mining, and we have a little bit left, less than 10%, and there are people trying to protect the last 10%.
So where are you taking us?
We will take you to the occupation of the Hambach forest, because for 5 years now, or 5.5 years, people try to protect the last bit of the Hambach forest, and they have built around about 22 tree houses where they live permanently during the whole year, and we just, yeah, say hi to them.
Okay. Let's go. Through the mud.
Through the mud.
Onward through the mud. It looks like we've come to yet another branch blockade right here. Why are these put up?
Well, they're put up as a sign to not have people in the forest we don't want to have in the forest, like coal mine company people or police. And as you can see, there's also a small path, so pedestrians are always welcome in the forest, but not cars.
Can you talk about the sacrifices people make?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very hard to live here because you have no running water, you have no electricity. People live here the whole year, so it's cold in winter, especially in winter it's very cold, and then summer it's better, but you have to get the water here somehow. You have to see where you get electricity from to cook, to charge your mobile phones.
How long have these tree houses been up?
The first occupation was in 2012 and it lasted half a year. And the second one was in 2014. And since 2014, there were always people living here.
We are standing directly in front of a barricade, which the people here have asked us not to film. Anna, can you read the banner that is draped from this barricade?
Yeah, it's saying, "You want us gone, but we'll be right here."
You want us gone, but we'll be right here. So we're not going to film the animals or the people right here, but we're going to go on to the tree houses. And can you tell us your name?
I'd rather not. Prefer to be anonymous.
Are you from Germany?
No, I'm not.
And have you been a part of this blockade, this occupation?
Yeah, I have stayed here for a couple of months.
Why?
Because when I'm here, I feel like I'm actively doing something. When I'm here, I find meaning in the work here. I learn a lot about repression, oppression, and climate change. And I feel like I take a stand here and make it possible both to create media attention and make people know about this place. But also for me personally, like feeling like I want to do something to help the world.
What do you think about the fact that you're right down the road from the UN Climate Summit? The world's countries are gathered to talk about the issue of climate change.
It's surreal. It feels surreal. Also, I'm a little bit angry because I fear not much will be done. As we've seen time and time again, there will be empty promises and no action behind it. People won't actually work to outface brown coal, to outface other types of fuels that are extremely, what do you call that? Polluting. Yeah.
And what do you mean by brown coal?
I mean that it's called ignite coal, I believe. There are two kinds of coal. There's coal and there's brown coal. Brown coal is more destructive for the environment because to be able to get it, you have to actually remove layers of the earth completely. Like you remove all the environment, and you can't just fill it up again because it's polluted. And also, its fuel worth isn't as good as with the normal coal. It's more polluting. It's compact, which means it gives off more carbon dioxide than coal does.
We're walking past the barricade into what looks like a village of tree houses. There are about 200 people here for a public tour. And talk about where we are and what you have done.
We are in a treehouse village in an occupied forest. It has been occupied for over 5 years now, and the occupation has the aim to prevent the exploitation of the mine. So it's not just about protecting the forest, but about fighting global warming, because this region of lignite mining and lignite power plants is the biggest source of CO2 emission in whole Europe.
How long have you lived here?
I think that's not so important. I've lived here for a while.
And Tom?
No matter if you're here for 1 week or for 5 years, we all do the same. We squat the trees, we organize our lives here, and yeah, we fight for a system change that makes it impossible for a company to do construction like other people.
Can you explain what the company is and what it's doing?
RWE is a multi-international company producing energy from lignite mining traditionally, but they also have stone coal that they export from, for example, Colombia or China, that also causes enormous damage also to indigenous people. They also have nuclear power plants, and now they have part of the company that does renewable energy, since it's where they can make money from now. The whole thing just works out for them because they don't have to pay the costs, but the costs of the environmental destruction happening because of lignite mining.
And can you talk about this open coal pit? How big is it?
It's nearly as big as Cologne, which is the next city here, where over 1 million people live.
And what is the company, how has the company responded to this occupation?
Well, they say what they do is legal, and because it's like legalized by the democracy, so they say what they do is right, and what we do here is illegal, and so they asked the police to evict us, what they have done in the past. But for us, that's a strong sign that the problem is the system we live in. So if it's legal for a company to destruct our whole planet, that means that it's time to also resist against state power.
Can you read this banner to us, Indigo, that's above your head?
The RWE, respect existence or expect resistance. Hambacher Forst.
Have the police attempted to evict you here?
Well, the last big eviction was around 3 years ago. They do evict us, but it's really hard and expensive for them. That means that, and also we have the rule that we reoccupy for weeks after the eviction. So they kind of left us alone the last years because they knew that it's a lot of trouble to evict us, which is already kind of a small victory because that gave us time to develop infrastructure here, both physically but also mentally and emotionally.
Why is it so difficult to evict you, and how much police power do they bring to this?
Well, it's hard to evict in treehouse. That's the reason why it's really efficient, because like our highest treehouse is I think 24 meters high. So first they have to come into a forest, and then they have to get a cherry picker there and evict you from the treehouse. Also, there are lock-ons on most tree houses, which makes it even harder for them to get the people out.
What's a lock?
A lock-on is something where you can lock on the tree, so it's not so easy to get you out of the tree.
Do you have electricity here?
Yes, we have some solar panels up in the trees, and actually that gives us enough energy to make computer work from here, to charge our phones, to have electric light in some of the tree houses. And also there's a windmill at the meadow occupation, so actually there's always weather, sun or wind, so we always have electricity.
Are you always afraid the police will raid?
I wouldn't say I'm afraid, because I'm here to fight. So from the first day I came here, I knew that police can enter all the time. So it gives me motivation to go on.
Can you take us into one of these tree houses?
Well, we have one that is acceptable by ladder. For the others, you have to
sleigh
climb a
living.
rope.
That'll do
We
it.
can go into the one that is acceptable.
We just climbed a ladder into this treehouse. Indigo and Tam are going to show us around. We just climbed up a ladder to get to this treehouse. When was this built? Can you describe it to us and how people live here?
This building is mostly called the Tower because it's built between 3 trees and has 3 stories. So it's basically the biggest tree house that we have. It was mainly built this summer because we made a big mobilization campaign, so we knew that a lot of people are going to come. So we needed a bigger common space and also space that people can get up without having to have a climbing harness and have to climb a rope. So it's also the idea to create it all a bit more barrier-free. So this is our communal kitchen. Here, the living room. We always cook for everyone. Most of the food we use is dumpster dive or gets donated to us. We cook vegan.
And you have a wood stove here.
Yeah.
And how does the sink and the stove operate?
Well, this works with the gas bottle. Unfortunately, we have to cook with gas, but it's just easier. And the sink just goes outside. We collect rainwater with the roof and take it down to wash dishes and so on.
Here's the living room and cooking space, as we said, and upstairs there's a communal sleeping place with, basically room for 15 people to sleep.
And it looks out over this whole village. Are there other villages like this in the woods?
Yeah, there are other villages.
I'm just wondering, Indigo, if you could talk about what you feel like in this tree house. Many meters up, many feet up. Not so far from COP, the UN Climate Summit.
Actually, for me, that's really a sign about how absurd it is that we believe that the people who were actually part of the people who caused this disaster, which is global warming, that we trust in them solving it, even though they are profiting from how the situation is right now. And that actually, just some kilometers away from there, there's the biggest CO2 source of whole Europe. And yeah, for me it seems really hypocritical that they're sitting there and talking about global warming and climate justice, because yeah, it really shows me that it's time that we take responsibility for our own lives and that we change something and that we create a world which gives us the power to act instead of hoping that other people will solve
You're
problems.
a tiny little bunny.
Believe in technical solutions. I think like there is a lot of hope in technical solutions and it can really help us. But we will not stop destroying this planet if we don't overcome capitalism and domination. And yeah, it's definitely not a good idea to replace lignite mining with nuclear power. Both costs enormous damage. And for me, it's one struggle that's really important for me. I'm not just fighting against lignite mining, but I'm fighting against exploitation in general. And that means fighting against capitalism, and that means fighting against domination. And that's why I see this as one struggle.
Have you ever spoken to any of the workers at the pit?
Yes, we do have contact with them, for example, with the workers' unions.
And what do they think?
They want to keep their working places. Actually, for me, it's really hard to do this discussion because for me, it's actually a racist discussion because we talk about 20 to 30,000 working places in Germany where people might lose their jobs. But we're also talking about people in the global south already dying from climate change, and there are thousands of them dying every day. So I don't want to talk about people losing their jobs because of lignite mining.
Can you describe this forest to us? The significance of it, and will this even be left if RWE, the company, succeeds in expanding the open coal pit?
Well, their plans are to cut down everything here this year until February. So if everyone goes as they plan, they will cut all the occupied parts of the forest until February. This means that it's more important than ever to resist, and that it's more important than ever to connect and network, to come here and get involved.
How easy is it to see the open pit?
Well, actually, RWE tries quite good to hide it. For example, if you drive on the highway close to the open pits here, because it's not just one, it's quite a few, you see hills next to the highway, and on the hills there are solar panels. And there are like trees next to the highway that says Tree of the Year 2008, Tree of the Year 2009. Actually, one other absurd thing is that this counts as reforestation, even though all these trees are just right next to the highway, so they will die. But RWE also has like a fancy place where you can see the pit, and where they have like signs on where they explain how great this technology is and that they have the biggest diggers in the world and so on. And actually some people go there to just have a Sunday trip with their children, or even to celebrate a wedding or something like this.
They have weddings at the open pit?
They do have, yeah.
And there's a restaurant there?
There's a restaurant, yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? What's the restaurant called?
I don't even know. Like, the platform is called Terra Nova, which means New Earth, which is already so absurd to me. But actually we called our compost toilet Terra Nova too.
We leave the occupied forest and drive just about 10 minutes to the largest open pit coal mine in Europe. It's run by RWE Power. It's 10 minutes from where we just were in the Hambacher forest.
I'm Milan Schwarze. I'm part of Ende Gelände. Ende Gelände is a we make action of civil disobedience against coal mining in Germany. So we think it's really necessary that we have to make one step more, go into the coal mines and coal mines like this, and occupy the diggers to stop them directly with our bodies.
And so tell us what you did last Sunday at the beginning of the UN Climate Summit.
Yeah, this was an amazing action. A lot of people, around 3,000 people, enter the coal mine. We start with a demonstration in one of the villages close to the coal mine. And then we split off in fingers. We have a 5-finger tactic. And they go directly into the coal mine and went to one of the diggers, and the police made a line in front of the diggers and wanted to protect the digger, because this is how it works in Germany. The police protect the coal mine company.
Now these are these massive excavation machines.
Yeah.
How large are they now?
250 meters long and 90 meters high. And they are the biggest diggers in the world. The people built a huge circle that the police can't catch them. And then the police came and pushed the people away, also with horses. And one policeman pushed one woman, one activist, in front of the horse, and the horse goes over the...
Trampled her?
Yeah. And stepped on her back. And this was a really crazy moment. And then the police came and pepper sprayed a lot of people, and so it was a dark moment of the action. But I think the area is too large and we are too strong, and the police can't stop us.
So you stopped this massive excavator from working?
We stopped the whole mine.
The whole operation?
Yeah. And it was a great feeling and a powerful moment. Also, I think it's a sign of hope sent to the world from us, because we want to say we can stop the companies, we can stop the fossils just by ourselves, with our own bodies, to stay in front of the diggers, to stay in front of the destruction, to stop it and to protect what we really love.
We are unstoppable. Another world is possible. Thousands of people chanting that after storming the Hambach open pit coal mine 2 weekends ago, temporarily stopping extraction at the largest open pit coal mine in Europe. When we come back, Democracy Now! Questions the Trump administration's climate advisor, David Banks, and get response from Kevin Anderson, climate scientist.
Good evening, and I'm so sorry we're late. Noam Chomsky's plane did make it from Boston. Hallelujah. I really could not have stepped into his shoes. I did have someone in the audience who would have, but thankfully Noam Chomsky is here. Now, my name is Paul Holdengraber, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, known as Live from the New York Public Library. My goal, as all of you know, is to make the lions roar, to make a heavy institution dance, and when successful, to make it levitate. As it may, I hope, tonight. I've always wondered how much this building weighs, and nobody in all these years, a decade I've been here, has been able to tell me. Now, let me just quickly mention some of the upcoming events, which include, not on your program, actor Matt Dillon, who will be joining Magnum photographer extraordinaire Bruce Davidson on May 4th. Our next event will be with Chris Hedges and Seymour Hirsch on May 3rd. The week of June 12th, we will end the season with 3 punches. This year's Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, will be joined by Pulitzer Prize winner Catherine Boo and journalist Masha Gessen. That is on June 13th. June 14th, Walter Mosley will join Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They will talk, of course, about basketball, but also will discuss their passion for detective fiction and much else. And to cap the season, I will be holding a conversation with a very great musician, and now also filmmaker Laurie Anderson. That is on June 16th. And in case you were wondering what might be happening between now and then, let me just mention that tomorrow we will have the great honor to welcome on this very stage Dame Helen Mirren to talk about everything from Shakespeare. As many of you probably know, the man died 400 years ago yesterday, I'm told. And we will talk about Shakespeare, but we will also talk about her great passion for Peter Brook, a passion I share, who is still alive and 90 years old and very well.
Yes?
Now, tonight, you probably know why you are here. I'm hoping for a true exchange between two extraordinary people. Now, Yanis Varoufakis, after the event and after a Q&A, now I'd like to say a quick word about Q&A. A microphone will be put right in front of the stage. I love the fact that some people are looking right there. A microphone will be put right there. You will queue up and you will ask intelligent questions, and they will not last longer than 52 seconds. I've actually determined that questions can be asked in 52 seconds or less. So you can't make a statement, but you can ask a question. Keep it short, keep it to the point. Yanis Varoufakis, at the end of that Q&A, will sign his new book, And the Weak Suffer What They Must, with a question mark. So come up and have the book signed after purchasing it from our independent bookstore, bookseller 192 Books. Now, I would like to say a big thank you to the Ford Foundation for their fantastic support to Live from the New York Public Library, as well as their support to many other cultural institutions across New York City. Thanks also go to the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, and always to Manaz and Adam Bartos. Now, for the last 7 or so years, I've asked my guests to give me a biography of themselves in 7 words. A haiku of sorts, or if you're very modern, a tweet. Chomsky was recalcitrant, which literally in Latin means kicking back. He hesitated. I really had to push him. And his 7 words reminded me of the 7 words that Werner Herzog gave me. Werner Herzog, when I asked him for 7 words, didn't quite know what the point was. And he said, filmmaker, no, he wrote, Werner Herzog, filmmaker originated in Sachang, Bavaria.
This is
Now, Noam Chomsky, in case you were wondering, linguistics and philosophy professor at MIT, author. Yanis Varoufakis gave me a biography that doesn't resemble Werner Herzog's or Noam Chomsky. Yanis Varoufakis, dedicated to subverting dominant paradigms, economic and political. Please welcome them.
These days, Bahira.
don't have anyone to introduce us, so I've been asked to kick off by saying, firstly, that isn't this wonderful that we're all here just to subvert the notion that nothing good can come out of the public sector? No.
Well, the fact that I'm here barely actually has a relationship to that comment. I came from Boston, my wife and I came from Boston 7 hours. In any society that hasn't been smashed by neoliberal policies of the kind you described, it would have taken maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. There is trained the pride of the public sector, which I took for the first time in 1950, and it's about 15 minutes faster now than it was then when it makes the schedule, which is a chancy situation. So we decided to come by airplane and spent most of the afternoon on the runway.
Well, Noam, what shall we talk about?
Well, we can talk about the neoliberal assault on the world's population in the last generation, which you've written so brilliantly about.
What strikes me, given the last quite eventful year of my life, what really strikes me is the major disconnect between the philosophy and ideology of neoliberalism and that which I encountered when negotiating, in inverted commas negotiating, when being dictated by the great and the good of the neoliberal international financial establishment. Now, think about it. If you take the great libertarians, the great neoliberals, castigate all tax-funded activities, and you consider the reason why I'm here today and I'm not still the Minister of Finance of Greece. Why? It's because I refuse another 100 billion dollars of a tax-backed loan to my insolvent government, which the creditors insisted that I should take.
3 nines.
It's astonishing. So here it is. Here you have the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission insisting that our bankrupt state takes on another 100 billion under conditions that guarantee that we will not be able to repay the taxpayers of Europe that will be granting us that money. And that comes from neoliberals, who supposedly are against all tax-funded loans to government, and who supposedly believe that an insolvent entity doesn't have the moral right to take on more loans.
But as you point out, 90% of those loans go to French and German bankers.
That was the first loan. This loan, it would go from the one pocket of the creditors to another pocket of the creditors, so that they would maintain the pretense that Greece was not bankrupt. But effectively, what I'm trying to say is the intense hypocrisy of the neoliberal establishment, which is not really even interested in sticking to its own neoliberal ideology. This is just 19th century power politics of crushing anyone who dares stand up to them and say a simple word, no.
But I think that's actually traditional. One of the paradoxes of neoliberalism is that it's not new and it's not liberal.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
If you look at what you describe is a form of hypocrisy, but the same is true of saying that we should not support tax-funded institutions. The financial sector is basically tax-funded.
Of course.
You recall the IMF study of the leading American banks, which determined that virtually all their profits come from their implicit government insurance policy, cheap credit, access to higher credit ratings, incentives to take risky transactions which are profitable, but then if it's problematic, you guys pay for it. Or just take the basis of the contemporary economy, which actually I've been privileged to see developing in government subsidized laboratories for decades. MIT, where I've been since the 1950s, is one of the institutions where the government, the funnel in the early days was the Pentagon, was pouring in money to create the basis for the high-tech economy of the future and the profit-making of the institutions that are regarded as private enterprises. It was decades of work under public funding with a very anti-capitalist ideology. So according to capitalist principles, if someone invests in a risky enterprise over a long period and 30 years later it makes them profit, they're supposed to get part of the profit. But it doesn't work like that here. It was the taxpayer who invested for decades. The profit goes to Apple and Microsoft, not to the taxpayer.
Indeed. If you take an iPhone apart, every single technology in it was developed by some government grant.
And for
every
long
single one.
And for long
And some of them
period.
by government grants from other countries,
Yeah.
like Wi-Fi from the Australian
And
Commonwealth.
you see an interesting picture of it from a place like MIT or other major research institutions. So if you walked around the building where I worked 50 years ago, you would have seen electronic firms, Raytheon, iTech, others, IBM, there to essentially rob the technology that's being developed at public expense and seeing if they can turn it into something applicable for profits. You walk around the institution today, you see different buildings. You see Novartis, Pfizer, big pharmaceutical corporations. Why? Because the cutting edge of the economy has shifted from electronics-based to biology-based. So therefore, the predators in the so-called private sector are there to see what they can pick up from the taxpayer-funded research in fundamental biological sciences. And that's called free enterprise and a free market system. So speak of hypocrisy, it's pretty hard to go beyond that.
Quite right. This hypocrisy is fundamental to the whole enterprise culture of capitalism from
the
250 years ago. I mean, the whole notion that there can be a market system which is at an arm's length separated from a state, which is the enemy, is the sickest joke in the history of humankind. If you think that, I mean, this narrative of private wealth creation, which is appropriated by the big bad wolf, the state, on behalf of trades unions and the working class that need a social welfare net, is just a preposterous reversal of the truth. That wealth is being created collectively and appropriated privately. But right from the beginning, I mean, the enclosures in Britain would never have happened without the king's army.
That's
and without state brutality for pushing peasants off their ancestors' land and creating the commodification of labor, the commodification of land, which then gave rise to capitalism. Just half an hour ago, we were being shown, some of us, the magnificent collection of maps of the city of New York in this wonderful building. And you could see in one of the maps of Alabama the precise depiction of the theft of land from Native Americans, the way in which it was parceled up, commodified. Now that would never have happened without the brutal intervention of the state, which created the process of privatization of land and therefore of commodification.
Actually, one of my favorite passages from Adam Smith is where he gives advice to the new colonies, to newly liberated colonies, as to how they should pursue sound economics, which is pretty much what the IMF tells the third world today. What he said is the advice was you should concentrate on what was later called comparative advantage, produce agricultural products, you're good at that, export furs, fish, and so on. But don't try to produce manufacturing goods, because Britain, England, has superior manufacturing goods. So therefore you should import them from England. They're good at that, you're good at cotton and corn. Incidentally, the cotton was hardly by free enterprise. And you should certainly not try to monopolize the resources that you have. And if you pursue those practices, then everybody will be better off. Economic theory proves that. Well, the United States happened to be free of English control. So therefore they were able to do the opposite, just as England had done. High tariffs to block British goods enabled them to create a textile industry at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Later in the century, a steel industry, blocking superior British steel, and right up to the present, as I've mentioned, with high tech. As far as monopolization is concerned, the U.S. made a major effort to monopolize the basic resource for the early Industrial Revolution, namely cotton. That's the oil of the 19th century. And the U.S. had most of it, not all of it. And the conquest of Mexico, which was not exactly by free enterprise, was largely undertaken to try to gain a monopoly of cotton, which would overcome the major enemy in those days, which was Britain. Britain was the big force, the enemy, and the Jacksonian presidents, Tyler, first 19th century, their position was that if we could monopolize cotton, we could bring England to our feet. That way we could really defeat them. They didn't quite make it, but made a lot. Incidentally, that effort was what Saddam Hussein was charged with in 1990. The charge was ludicrous, but the charge was he was going to try to monopolize oil and bring us all to his feet, which was crazy. But the U.S. did try to monopolize cotton, and that's part of the way in which power shifted from England to the United States. I think that's a pretty good record of the way sound economics has worked over the years. There have been places where sound economics was applied, liberal policies. It's called the third world. And it's not an accident. You take a look at the global south. One country developed, Japan, the one country that was not colonized. Take a look at East Asia, the tigers of East Asia. One exception, the one that was conquered by the United States, 1898, with a couple 100,000 people killed and stays semi-colonized, not part of the Asian tiger explosion of industrialization. The pattern is just uniform, but somehow hasn't entered economic theory. Wonder why. You're an economist.
Well, the reason why it never entered economic theory was because economics in universities began to evolve from the 1950s onwards as the queen of the social sciences. And what gave discursive power and monopoly power within the academic environment to economics was the claim that it was the only social theory which was peddling universal truths to be proven by mathematical means. And it succeeded. So when a sociologist, an anthropologist, and an economist applied for a grant, it was always the economist who got it on the basis of this discursive monopoly. And however, in order to close the model mathematically, the only way to solve the equations is by making assumptions that distance the model from really existing capitalism. So for instance, you have to assume that there's no time and there's no space. Because if you allow time to interfere with your model or space to enter, you end up with indeterminacy. In other words, you end up with a system of equations that cannot be solved or that have an infinity of possible solutions, and then you have no predictive power. You can't say, well, this is what's going to happen. So we have a very interesting inverse Darwinian process. The more successful economists were at creating models that said precisely nothing about capitalism, the greater their success in the academy. So they became the opposite of the public intellectuals that you've been writing about. They create wonderful abstractions, aesthetically pleasing models that I spent quite a few years studying, in the same way that you go to a museum and you look at a piece of abstract art, but you don't expect to find the truth of capitalism in its form. So this is the interesting sociology of knowledge within the economics profession. But then there is a parallel shift, the end of Bretton Woods, which unleashed banking. Remember, Roosevelt made sure that in the Bretton Woods Conference, which designed the post-war, the first post-war phase between the 1940s and 1971, 1973, he had stipulated that one kind of person should not be allowed into the Bretton Woods Conference. You know who these people were? Bankers. Not one banker attended the Bretton Woods Conference, and that was at the explicit order of FDR.
And it showed.
And so you had boring banks between 1944 and 1971. But after 1971, and we can discuss why that is, suddenly banking was unleashed, and their capacity effectively to mint private money became unlimited and essential to the second post-war phase of global capitalism, of American hegemony. During this unleashing, there was a need for a theoretical and ideological cover. So I don't blame my fellow economists for pulling the trigger that created so much devastation in 2008 and before that and after that, but I blame them for providing the mathematical models, the sermons, which steadied the hand of the financiers and allowed them to believe that what they were doing was perfectly okay, consistent with science, provable mathematically that it was riskless, and therefore allowed them the mental and emotional strength to do a lot more damage than they would have done otherwise.
Actually, one of the more interesting moments in the history of science and scholarship was actually in 2008. For, as you know, for decades, economists had been claiming with extreme arrogance that they completely understood how to control and manage an economy. There were fundamental principles like the efficient market hypothesis, rational expectations, and anyone who didn't accept this was dismissed as a kind of some strange kind of moron. The whole system collapsed. The whole intellectual edifice collapsed in a most amazing fashion and had no effect on the profession.
None at all. Well, it did have. It had the effect that sometimes, you know, when we're driving on a freeway, and I usually go well above the speed limit, condemn if you will, and I get stopped by the police, for the next 20 minutes I drive below the speed limit. But it doesn't last for more than 20 minutes. Then after a while I just go back to where I was. This is exactly like the economics profession. They had a brief moment of
some did, but
some, or at least of being a bit humble and staying, you know, keeping their heads under the parapet. for a bit, but then within 20 minutes they forgot about it and they carried on teaching the same rubbish to their students. But what is interesting, Noam, is two small points. It's not that the economists went headlong into this mathematized religion, because that's what it is. It's a religion with equations and with a bit of bad statistics. What happened was two things. Firstly, there was a kind of ethnic cleansing of anybody that had retained their wits about the economy. So there were economists who challenged this view and who were simply not reproduced by the system. They never got the grants, they never got the PhD students, their PhD students never got lectureships, never got assistant professorships. So there was a purge of this stuff. The second, which is a far more interesting phenomenon, is that the wonderful minds that created the general equilibrium models, the highest, the popes of the Catholic Church, right, were not believers. So take, for instance, Ken Arrow. Ken Arrow is, and Gerard de Brey. They're the ones that John Nash, they established the mathematical theorems upon which all this hypocrisy is based. Now, these people, Ken Arrow, I remember in the early 1990s, he was giving a talk at NYU. And there were about 20 people. It was a highly mathematized paper. Okay, so he was enthusiastically going through the equations, and one of the professors there interrupted him at some point and said, "Professor Arrow, equation 3.3 reminds me of the argument in favor of this kind of tax as opposed to that kind of tax." And Ken stopped him immediately and said, "My dear boy," he was a bit condescending, I think rightly so, he said, "You're confusing that which is interesting with that which is useful. This is interesting. If you try to apply to anything real, it's dangerous." So the gurus, the popes, understood that this theory was examining a post-capitalist world, a world without labor markets, without labor exploitation, without monopolies, without even the slightest of capacities to alter prices on the behalf of employers, of entrepreneurs, of conglomerates, a world without firms. Because what is a company? A company is a market-free zone. It's a hierarchy. It's a small Soviet Union with Gosplan and central planning. If you look at Google, if you look at Microsoft, that's what it is.
Then you have Cose's theorem. That's a big help.
Yes, yes. But the Cose's theorem is taught for 5 seconds and then forgotten.
Yeah.
In order to make them feel that they've said something about the reason why firms exist. Yeah. But then in those models that produce the macroeconomic policies that were applied even under Clinton, especially under Clinton, there are no firms. There's no time, no firms, no space. Everybody resides on the same point in space, so that there are no costs of transport or anything like that. So imagine a world in which economic policy is predicated upon models that assume there is no time, space, firms, profit, or economic
monopolies.
It's time to get really scared.
There's a question that I'm sure you know the answer to from your own experience, which has kind of puzzled me about contemporary economists. It has to do with the IMF and your experience as Greek finance minister. From what I can see from the outside, it looked as if the IMF economists were pretty harshly criticizing the austerity policies of the Troika, but the IMF itself was strongly supporting it. So what was going on in there?
Well, this is exactly what was happening and is happening at this very moment. WikiLeaks leaked a wonderful conversation between my old friend Paul Thompson, who made his name by crashing the Greek economy and then, as a result, being promoted to IMF chief in Europe, and his successor, a Romanian lady going by the name of Delia Populescu. Just read this exchange. Just read it. It came out a few weeks ago. WikiLeaks, go and look at it. It's fantastic. Because they're telling the truth. And they're telling exactly what you're saying. They are admitting that which Paul Thompson and I had this conversation. First time I met the IMF's chief in Europe was in a hotel in Paris, and I was elected with a mandate to negotiate a debt write-down for the Greek debt. against the Troika, lenders, against the wishes of the creditors. But at the same time, because I had a mandate to negotiate, not to clash with the creditors, I was prepared to clash if I had to, but my intention was not to clash. My intention was to come to an honorable agreement between us. So because I knew that the German government had a very serious political problem going to the federal parliament in Berlin, to the Bundestag, and admitting that the money they had given to the Greeks was not money to the Greeks, for the Greeks, but money for Deutsche Bank.
Yeah.
And therefore, they were never really expecting to get it back. So this is why we're going to give the Greeks a debt restructure. That's what Mrs. Merkel should have said to the Bundestag, but of course, this is not something she could have said and remained the Chancellor of Germany. So I knew that the Germans had a political problem admitting to what they had done, in the sense of having given money to the Greeks, so that effectively the German taxpayer and the Slovak taxpayer, because they spread the risk like good financiers do to the other Europeans, effectively they were bailing out their banks a second time in 12 months. So of course I knew that, and I was trying to find a formula that would allow our debt to become more manageable and less toxic for the Greek people, while at the same time achieving a kind of political arrangement with Berlin that would make it palatable for them to say yes to it. So first meeting with Paul Thompson, I come to him with a proposal for the kind of debt swaps, financial engineering that Wall Street is very good at. Not the kind of thing that one expects from a left-wing Minister of Finance, but I wanted to make things work at that point, not so much to go and clash with them. And you know what he said? Oh, this is too mild. We need to take a large chunk of your debt and write it off immediately. I said, well, that's music to my ear, Paul. How are you going to convince Wolfgang Schäuble to do this? Oh, I said, well, that's a problem, you know. But we'll find a way. So, at this level of bilateral discussions, even with the leadership of the IMF, you got the idea that they understood what they had done. They knew that they had done a nasty deed. There was subterfuge in what they had done. There was a bailout for banks presented as solidarity to a suffering nation. And they were trying to do something about it. But then, when it came to final settlement, as creditors, they stuck to one another. They remained loyal to one another. They spread the rumor that our government was putting forward impossible demands, that we didn't want to reform, that we had no proposals. We came to them with financial engineering proposals from Wall Street. They had nothing to suggest except for these signals that they were emitting. But I think the most important discussion I had was with somebody really high up in the IMF. The name will not be mentioned. Higher up than Paul Thompson, you can imagine. After 10 hours of negotiations, when we got into the nitty-gritty, these extremely boring meetings with aides, with advisors, with experts, with committee on pensions and another committee on VAT and other, in the end, we ended up together and we had a discussion. Confidential discussion, tête-à-tête. And I heard the following words. Yanis, of course you're right. These policies we're trying to impose upon you can't work. I thought, oh no. You know, deep down, I don't know whether you have this. You probably don't. You're Noam Chomsky, you wouldn't. But I'm less experienced in this game of clashing with powers that be at that level. And deep down, I think if I psychoanalyze myself, I really wanted to think that the adults know what they're doing. And that I'm the child that is recalcitrant and kicking and screaming. But deep down, the adults, you know, the people in power at the top of the IMF know what they're doing. And my complaints and protestations, maybe they're not completely accurate. Maybe they know more than I think they do. But when these people turn around to me and say, you're right, it can't work. What we are trying to impose upon your nation can't work. But, Yanis, you must understand, we have invested so much political capital in this problem. We can't go back. And your credibility, my credibility, depends on accepting it. I think that answers your question.
Well, how do the participants in the Troika deliberations react to the technical papers that are coming out from the IMF economists saying, their own economists, Blanchard and others, saying these policies of austerity under recession are just destructive.
It's very simple. They ignore them.
What do they
In
say?
the Eurogroup, these were never mentioned. I mentioned them. I quoted chapter and verse from their own statisticians and economists like Olivier Blanchard. I quote, there was also a remarkable study from the IMF showing that the liberalization of labor markets, the removal of protection of labor, of trade union protections, trade union rights, protection from unfair dismissal and all that in the end is counterproductive when it comes to competitiveness and productivity. The IMF came out with this in the spring of 2014. A beautiful report. It could have been written by a progressive economist from New School, right?
What exactly did it conclude? But what did it conclude exactly?
It concluded that these labor market reforms that the IMF had been pushing down the throat of countries from Africa to Asia to Europe, they don't work. They do not enhance competitiveness, especially when investment is subdued, which was always my argument. So I quoted that as well in the Europe. I might have been singing the national anthem of Sweden.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same thing, because you've got to understand that these meetings are quite brutal. They have already decided what they're going to do. The ministers are treated like vermin by their own minders and by the representatives of the Troika. Something that very few people know is that the Eurogroup is actually led by the Troika, not by the finance ministers, the elected representatives of the nations. So you've got the head of the Eurogroup, who is usually, let's face it, appointed by Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble. Then next to him, there is the real ruler of the European Union, a gentleman called Thomas Wieser. Nobody has heard of him, but he wields the real power. He tells...
What is his position?
He's the head of the Euro Working Group, which is the cabinet under the Eurogroup.
The non-existent group.
Yes, they are the shadow cabinet of the non-existent Eurogroup.
Yeah.
And this gentleman has been around now for years.
How does the Eurogroup get established? You don't discuss this in your book. You just say it's there.
I think it just sprung out.
Yeah.
You know, out of the shell, like Aphrodite in Cyprus. Look, when we created in our infinite wisdom a common currency, and we had a common central bank, but without a state to correspond to the central bank, and went up with states that didn't have a central bank, because that common central bank was created on the proviso that it would not come to the assistance ever of any of the states of which it would be the central bank. They decided that, well, every now and then, the finance ministers of these nations that now don't have a central bank, but they have created a common central bank, should get together and discuss economic policy to coordinate. So this is how it emerged. It's not in any treaty. And do you know how I found that out?
So the Eurogroup consists of the finance ministers?
Yes, well, that was the initial idea. The finance ministers, and one of them chairs. Before Dijsselbloem, who's now the president, it was the head of the largest tax haven in the world, Luxembourg. Certain Jean-Claude Juncker.
The United States is getting close.
Not as badly as Luxembourg. Not as badly as Luxembourg.
A couple of states.
Yes, it's close, but not as bad.
Not at that level.
But ever since this Eurozone, which, by the way, the euro is a carbon copy of the gold standard of the 1920s. It was created in the image of the gold standard of the 1920s. So you know what happened to the gold standard of the 1920s. It gave rise to the roaring 20s, to immense financialization, immense concentration of industrial power, funded by the consolidation of the financial sector, and then Wall Street in 1920.
Enormous inequality.
Of course, enormous inequality, which is the result of this easy private money minting by the financial sector. And when the chickens came home to roost in 1929, the common currency, that era, the gold exchange, started to collapse, started fragmenting. Very soon, the Germans hated the French hated the Germans, everybody hated the Greeks, and we descended into the abyss of the 1930s and 1940s. After our generation's 1929, which took place in 2008, guess what happened? The gold standard started fragmenting. It was called the Europe. And very soon after that, the Germans started pointing moralizing fingers at the Greeks. The Greeks remembered the Nazi occupation. Everybody hated the French. And we are now in a state of disintegration where the refugees are the problem.
Actually, you should bring up 1953, the London Agreement, which most people don't know about. That's rather critical. Of course. Maybe you want to say
let
a
me
few
just
words
answer
about that.
complete the
Yeah.
story about the Euro. I'll just tell you the story of how I found out that the Eurogroup doesn't exist in law. By the way, one more point. After our country started to go failing...
Is it inconsistent with European law or just
no, it doesn't exist in
to
law.
it? It's kind of orthogonal, no connection.
It's outside the framework of European law.
Now, do its decisions impact, how do its decisions impact
It makes all the important decisions that determine the future of Europe.
And
every single one.
How are those decisions transmitted to the official decision-making bodies, to the Brussels bureaucracy?
Oh, yes, what happens is, there is the Eurogroup meeting, and then afterwards there is an ECOFIN meeting. The ECOFIN does exist. It's the meeting of all the European Union finance ministers, including the ones that are not using the euro. So John Osborne from Britain is there, the Danish finance minister is there. And what happens, it's a rubber stamping process. So whatever the Europe has decided, ECOFIN says, okay, we agree. And there's never any debate.
No debate.
Yeah.
No debate.
But let me tell you, this is quite interesting. How I came to understand that this is a paralegal group. At some point, the Troika inside the Eurogroup, because now it's not just the finance ministers, the IMF, Lagarde is sitting there, Thompson is sitting there, the European Central Bank is sitting there, the Commission is sitting there, they set the scene, and then the vermin, us, the finance ministers, simply nod.
And the IMF,
happily.
The IMF has no reaction to the Eurogroup decisions.
Well, it's in the Eurogroup. The IMF is part of the Eurogroup.
They're
it's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah. So they're represented in the Eurogroup.
Well, let me give you an example. When the ultimatum was presented to me on the 25th of June, on a take it or leave it basis, and what that meant was that if I said no, I'm leaving it, our banks would have been closed as they were 5 days later.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a pretty powerful ultimatum. It's like making me an offer that I can't refuse, even though we refused it for a while, until we caved in and then I resigned. But this is interesting. I was presented with this ultimatum. It comprised 3 chunks. One was the fiscal policy that we would have to follow for the next 20 years. Interesting. It's interesting given that our mandate from the Greek people was only for 4 years.
This is spelled out
in black and white. Yeah. What the primary surplus could be, what the tax take should be, what measures we should use, what the VAT rate should be in order to get that primary surplus. Chapter 1. Chapter 2.
This is specifically for Greece.
Only for Greece.
Yeah. Has there been something similar for Spain?
Yes.
Italy?
Yeah. Portugal.
Yeah.
This colonization is at full blast.
It
started with Greece. All bad things started with Greece. And then they spread out. Greece is the laboratory of this anthropology.
How do they deal with France?
But France, of course, is the final destination.
Yeah.
And the beauty...
Is that beginning?
The second part of each part of the ritual. Our enemy wears many forms, but all of them are darkness.
The beauty of those 5-6 months in power. Not what power. In office.
Watching power.
In office. The beauty of it was, we academics, all our lives, we theorize about things. Okay, we try to get evidence, but we theorize. During those 5 months, I didn't have to theorize. And to answer your question about France, at some point I was having a very interesting conversation. I had many interesting conversations with the finance minister of Germany, Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble. At some point, when I showed him this ultimatum, and I said to him, it's a long story, but I'll cut it short. I said to him, would you sign this? Just let's take off our hats as finance ministers for a moment. I've been in politics for 5 months. You've been in politics for 40 years. You keep barking in my ear that I should sign it. Stop telling me what to do. As human beings, you know that my people now are suffering a great depression. We have children at school that faint as a result of malnutrition. Can you just do me the favor and advise me on what to do? Don't tell me what to do. As somebody with 40 years, a Europeanist, somebody who comes from a democratic country, just Wolfgang to Yanis, not finance minister to finance minister. And to his credit, he looked out of the window for a while. And he turned to me and he said, well, the question that I'd actually asked him was, would you sign this? And he turned around and he said, as a patriot, I wouldn't. Of course, the next question was, so why are you forcing me to do it? He said, don't you understand? I did this in the Baltics, in Portugal, in Ireland. You know, we have discipline to look after, and I want to take the Troika to Paris.
He said?
Yes. So, I don't need to theorize. It starts with Greece. Greece is a pipsqueak country. It's not that important. But you start with that small problem. You impose these unsustainable loans, which give creditors huge power, and then you start cutting, because the final intention, and I try to explain this in this book, is to curtail the Parisian elite's long-standing ambition to usurp the power of the Deutschmark for the purposes of expanding the French nation-state's reach and control of Europe.
Also, I presume, for the Bundesbank to be able to control the French budget.
Absolutely, not so much the Bundesbank, but the Federal Finance Minister, Schäuble himself. And I don't blame the Germans for that. If you go back to 1992, when this euro was first created, Maastricht Treaty, to convince the French to vote for it, the French conservative newspaper Le Figaro had a headline that was offensive to human beings. It read, as an encouragement to the French to love the Maastricht Treaty, Maastricht, and underneath, a new Versailles Treaty without a shot being fired. Now that is offensive to the German people. It is offensive to anyone who understands the pain of the Second World War. It is offensive to all well-intentioned human
And you
beings.
think French elites actually believed that at Maastricht?
Absolutely. This was the intention. Look, de Gaulle in 1965, in response to a journalist who asked him, don't you worry that with this European Economic Union, Germany is going to become the powerful country here? And his response was, they are going to be the horse, and we are going to be the carriage driver. It's clear.
The Brussels bureaucrats.
The French graduates of the great Grande École, who would be populating the Brussels bureaucracy. So we should not be anti-German, anti-French, or anything. We just must understand that the elites of Europe have made a complete and utter mess of the project of European Union.
Yeah, but when you get to Maastricht, the French elites still believed that they were controlling German power in the Maastricht Treaty.
Yes.
That's pretty astonishing.
It's an astonishing error on their part. But so was the German elite's estimation that Helmut Kohl, for instance, who was a Europeanist, who was a federalist deep down, that you create a currency union first, and then when it gets in trouble, the political union will follow. What an error. When you create a gold standard, it starts fragmenting. You're not going to end up with a political union. You're going to end up with an abyss. You're going to end up with Le Pen in government in France, Golden Dawn in Greece, the AfD in Germany, and the fragmentation.
You think he understood, say, Nicholas Caldor's prediction?
He never did.
Never.
No, none of them did.
Including Kohl.
Including Kohl. He didn't understand it, and he didn't believe it. He really genuinely thought, in a rather simple mind,